Hello, I'm Stephen Harriott, and this is The Stephen Harriott Show by Catholic Vote. You've probably already heard most of the story of Alfie Evans. In any case, I advise you to search for it online and just hear the tragic story for yourself. Essentially, this is another disabled little boy, not unlike Charlie Gard, who's been condemned to death by European courts against the will of his parents. First of all, let's name the evil we're dealing with. What's happening to Alfie Evans is secular progressive leftism. Now, some lefty Catholics are already saying, don't use Alfie to attack your political opponents, that's crass. Well, that's funny, I never heard you say that about victims of gun violence, whom you've used, I think wrongly, against your enemies in the gun debate. No, insofar as there are philosophical and policy positions that lead to travesties like this case, it's legitimate to cite this case in arguments against those philosophies and policy positions. And, as it happens, those policy positions and those philosophies are those of secular leftism. Secular leftism doesn't recognize the basic worth and dignity of the human person. In fact, secular leftism is materialist. It's what Scripture would call worldly, and it doesn't see any inherent value in the human person. To the secular leftist, life isn't an eternal adventure of a creature made in the image and likeness of God, or a call to eternal unity with the Creator and His saints. Instead, life is just a brief series of sensory experiences, which can either be fun or no fun. So when a person comes along who might not have enough fun to make his life worth living, or who might cost the people around him more fun than he's worth, the secular leftist might just toss him out of life, kill him. What's more, with no basic grasp of the dignity that comes with individual human free will, the secular leftist has no reason not to allow massive institutions like the state to take over and make really important decisions for us, including life or death decisions like the decision that should have been left to Alfie's parents about whether to offer him more care in Italy. Secular leftism is not a tool for creating Catholic social justice. It's an ideology that always victimizes the most vulnerable persons in society. Incidentally, that's why secular leftism has always been an anti-Christian ideology, because the church is all about serving the least of these persons, while secular leftism just wants to use, victimize, discard them, because secular leftism fundamentally rejects the idea of what a human person is. Ghastly stuff, and we have to fight it. In fact, as Christians, we have a special responsibility to fight it. When lives are at stake, and believe me, many of them are, not just Alfie's, but anyone whom the worldly might get away with victimizing, from Mideast Christians to black unborn babies in New York City, to the elderly in Hawaii, to Jews in modern Germany. When lives are at stake, part of the responsibility of being a Christian is making sure that those lives don't fall into the hands of untrustworthy, incompetent, or weak-willed defenders. Don't get me wrong, by the grace of God, people can change on a dime. But there are some groups, and certainly schools of thought, that just don't deserve to be entrusted with the future of Catholic witness against secular leftist attacks on human dignity. The Catholic left. Many on the Catholic left like to go after the pro-life movement, partly because the pro-life movement happens to tend to be very anti-secular leftism. They say, you only care about people before they're born. What about refugees? What about minorities? What about the poor? What about the marginalized? In other words, what about the secular leftist solutions that we have on offer for those victims? Give us more power! Well, as I've explained before, first of all, those victim groups have the same human dignity as the unborn, but they're not as much under threat because it isn't legal or common to just straight up kill them, as it is for the unborn. But anyway, Alfie is born. Alfie is a refugee. Alfie is poor. Alfie is a minority, being disabled. Alfie is marginalized. And what is the evil Catholic pro-life movement doing about him? Well, we're all up in arms to defend him. And what does the Catholic left have to say about Alfie? Well, a lot of them have very little or nothing to say. Maybe because it's Alfie versus the secular leftist state, and the secular leftist state is all they really cared about defending in the first place. Anyway, those on the Catholic left who do have something to say about Alfie are mostly abysmal failures at really taking a strong stance for innocent human life when it's under threat. As I reported at the time, when European courts condemned Charlie Gard to death, papal biographer and Crux contributor Austin Ivory sided with the courts against the family. Like a lot of Catholic intellectuals, Ivory correctly cited Catholic teaching on end-of-life care, which is very broad and allows families to decide against further care in terminal cases, but then claimed, with no supporting argument, that the Catholic teaching leads to the conclusion that doctors and government officials have the right to make that decision for a family and to enforce it against the family's will if they resist. And then he condemned as grotesquely insulting the accusation of Charlie's advocates that the doctors and judges wanted him dead, even though that was the claim that Charlie's own parents had made. In other words, Austin indirectly scolded Charlie Gard's family for their outcries against the state that murdered their son. Despicable. And he has the same detestable position in Alfie's case. And Ivory wasn't alone in Charlie's case. America Magazine published an article against the pro-lifers who, quote, reflexively leapt to the defense of the Gard family. It's the proper role of the state to protect the best interests of children, the article said, even if that means resolving disputes from the parents. Charlie's advocates failed to recognize the nuances of Catholic teaching on end-of-life care. When life is valued so highly relative to other goods, its pursuit becomes detrimental. Unfortunately, neither can even the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy be completely depended upon. The initial statement on Charlie Gard from the president of the Pontifical Academy for Life, Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia, hemmed and hawed about the complexity of the situation, but endorsed the doctors and judges who were, quote, called to decide Charlie's fate. The Archbishop wrote that the patient's best interests, at this point already determined by the courts to be death, were paramount. He repeated the exact words, best interests of, used by the judge who originally ruled against the parents' right to seek further treatment. And when it came to Alfie, true to form, Archbishop Paglia sided with the judge against Alfie's family in the initial ruling in March. A similar statement from the bishops of England and Wales was just as weak and amoral. The bishops even went out of their way to defend the hospital staff against the criticism of Alfie's advocates, instead of defending Alfie against the hospital. Good to know that when human rights and an innocent child's life are at stake, many Catholic leaders will bravely take a stand for complexity and nuance. These soft little daisies, these men, cannot be relied upon to defend innocent human life in a crisis. And it's not fair to victims to pretend that they can be. They're missing the point, whether they intend to or not, because they refuse to look the evil in the face, name it, and denounce it. Secular Leftism, the agenda that takes away our freedoms and responsibilities, also takes away our dignity as moral agents. It's no surprise that when we get universalized state health care, we also get a universalized state conscience. Under secular leftist states, individuals, families, and even voluntary associations like the Catholic Church are not allowed to make independent moral choices in providing for their own. Nuns can't decide against providing abortifacient drugs, healthcare clinics can't decide against advertising for abortion clinics, and parents can't even decide against starving their own children to death. Instead, these decisions are made according to the conscience of the state, which makes a point of being amoral and godless. This isn't a question of what's best for a disabled child. It's a question of whether we should give a secular leftist state the power to make those decisions for us and to enforce them against the child's parents if they resist. And I guess we shouldn't be surprised that when the soldiers come after the least of these, whom Christ commanded us to treat as himself, Judas shows up too, to give the innocent victims a little kiss before they're executed. Turns out, not every apostle is reliable. But it's up to Catholic anti-secular leftists, including laity, in this still relatively free nation, to name, understand, and act against this ideology, and not to hand the fate of innocence over to traitors and weaklings. We can't forget the lessons we've learned from the UK, from Charlie Gard, from Alfie Evans. We have to remember them in our prayers, in our activism, and yes, when we vote. Again, since it's always the least of these brethren, the weak and the helpless, who end up in the crosshairs, being a Christian is a great responsibility. This is the Stephen Harriott Show, the show that's never wrong except on purpose. I'm your host, Stephen Harriott.